Morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Good morning.
My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president and CEO of Save the Persecuted Christians, which is very pleased to be sponsoring this program at the invitation of the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Ambassador Sam Brownback, a great friend of the cause that we are working to advance, a leader really on so many different issues, particularly in his previous incarnations as a congressman, as a senator, as a governor of one of our states. In his present role, however, he is really leading, I think, the world to a heightened awareness of the threats to religious freedom in general and to the need to safeguard them and get the world mobilized on behalf particularly of those who are being persecuted for their faiths. We here are to speak about the most egregious example of the persecution of people for their faith, namely the degree to which we are witnessing in our time an absolutely unprecedented onslaught against people simply because they follow Jesus Christ. This is a global problem. We're going to talk about some of the places in which it is manifesting itself, but we should never lose sight of the fact that it is happening virtually all over the world. Some of the banners that are here are part of an exhibit that Save the Persecuted Christians has organized. Very proud to have displayed it at an international conference at the government of Hungary, which is very well represented here, hosted in Budapest in November. This is just a sample of what is going on and why we are seeking in our time to build a grassroots movement in the United States that will seek to address this problem not simply symptomatically, important as that is, but in a wholesale way. Because when you learn from organizations with whom we work.
Testing.
I'm not speaking adequately. What we have learned from some of the organizations with whom we work, like Aid to the Church in Need, which has, by several reports, estimated the number of Christians being persecuted around the world to be approximately 327 million, which is approximately the same number of men, women, and children in the United States of America. Staggering statistic. There is a smaller set of people, Christians, who are being heavily, extremely, and terribly persecuted. That's estimated to be 260 million by our friends at Open Doors USA, which is a number that is 15 million more than we were told was happening the year before. And that was 15 million more than the year before that, 2018. Christina, please come up.
I'm so sorry.
I want all of our speakers to join us up here, if you would. Dr. Shayo, Tristan, Faith, please come on up. We're going to, as I said, talk a bit about the nature of this problem as it is manifesting itself in different areas of the world, different countries, different regions, and we're very excited to have terrific speakers with us for that purpose. But I just want to close this brief opening remarks with why we think an additional effort is needed. It takes nothing away from the marvelous organizations and individuals who are doing what they can to relieve the suffering of Christians, to say that it's not enough. what we believe is needed now is something that will affect the calculations of the people doing the persecution by holding them accountable for what they're doing and creating costs to them for their crimes against humanity. We're confident, as we've seen in the microcosmic example of Pastor Andrew Brunson in Turkey a few years back, that when President Trump, who was here, of course, at this National Prayer Breakfast, just finished addressing us, took steps to hold the government of Turkey accountable and to create real costs to it for the persecution of this individual pastor. It had a very salutary effect. That, we think, can be done on a much larger scale and certainly needs to be. So we're here to talk a bit about the problem. Bob Fu, please come up. And we're going to talk as well about what must be done about it. For that purpose, I am particularly proud to be able to welcome a man who has been an inspiration for all of us concerned about the problems of those who seek to practice their religious liberties. A man who has, as a member of the United States Congress for the better part of 30-odd years, been a leader, nationally and internationally, in showing how those rights can be safeguarded and why it is obligatory for all of us to ensure they are. His name is Congressman Frank Wolf, formerly my congressman, representing the people of Northern Virginia. We're delighted to have him with us. Congressman, the floor is yours.
I'll just do that. No, I mean, okay, I'll speak loud.
You will speak loud.
I'm going to be really brief and kind of speak not for any group, but really for myself. One, I appreciate what the Hungarian government, when I was in Iraq, I saw your banners all over, and I'm very grateful. You've made a big difference, and I think through the good efforts of this administration and Vice President Pence, our government is now doing some pretty good work in the Middle East. I'm going to end with a controversial comment, but I'll start. We know now, you heard the President speak today, and I think this administration has done an outstanding job. Secondly, I think this is a bipartisan issue. There are good Democrats and good Republicans that care deeply. So this is not a partisan, divisive issue. This is an issue that kind of brings together. Those two members that you heard speaking today, one Republican, one Democrat, it was their idea to make the issue of religious freedom kind of the prominent thing. There are so many. I look around and I see my friend from Lebanon, and I can talk about Lebanon. I think the world is so difficult. China, clearly. Bob will explain. Catholic bishops harass Protestant pastors in jail. 1 to 2 to 3,000 Uyghurs that are in basically concentration camps. It's the Falun Gong. There's still the organ donors killing people. I mean, we should be outraged. And yet there's a relatively silence, and I'm going to cover that at the end. We see in Nigeria. I mean, Boko Haram in Nigeria has killed more people in Nigeria than ISIS killed in Syria and Iraq combined. Christians, Muslims, and Yazidis. But I do believe, and I have great confidence in this administration, they will be acting to do something. I personally believe we need a special envoy for Nigeria and the Lake Chad region to work on terrorism, to work on hunger, to work on sexual trafficking, to work on corruption. But there's so many places around the world. Cuba, I mean, 90 miles off the coast, and it's almost like we're almost silent. Why should we be interested in it? There are so many passages in the Bible. Isaiah, Ecclesiastes 4:1. I looked, I saw all the oppression under the sun. I mean, Luke, where Jesus reads from in the synagogue in Nazareth. There's so many passages. So the fundamental difference that I believe that why we're relatively failing is the church has failed and the church is relatively silent. There used to be, when we passed the International Religious Freedom Bill, there was a religious freedom Sunday where many churches, most churches, had a Sudanese, had somebody from China, so they're almost all gone. So I think the church, my own views, you may not agree, is fundamentally failing on an issue whether if you're a believer or not. There's a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Charles Malik, one of the giants. I mean, I go to school and I ask people who Charles Malik is. No one knows who Charles Malik is. Charles Malik was the director of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He's a giant. Now there will be, for those of you in the Washington, D.C. area, there will be an event at the Library of Congress, I think on May 19th, where Habib, his son, will be showing a film and try to educate America. But Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the passages in the Bible. What do I think that should be done? One, everyone ought to read Dr. Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail. I go into some places that people haven't read it. I would assume all of you have read it, and if you haven't, you ought to go. It is time for us to read that letter. And I got up early today to put some of these comments together. I think it's time for some of our religious leaders, and if they do that, I will join them, to be prepared to go to jail.
Yes.
To go to jail for what they believe. Joseph in the Bible went to jail for what he believed.
Yes.
Daniel, for what he believed, Daniel went to jail. John the Baptist went to jail. Paul went to jail. Dietrich Bonhoeffer went to jail. Reverend Martin Luther King went to jail. Until the pastors, and if any of you are pastors and religious leaders, you want to be organized, the prominent leaders, the pastors, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, to come together and pick out whether it be China or Nigeria or Lebanon or Cuba, to be prepared to go to jail. If you're a pastor and you believe in the passages in the Bible and you're not prepared to go to jail, then you're fundamentally failing. I talked to a young student. I talked to a young student the other day. You all know, raise your hand if you know. Do you know what the Confucius Institutes are?
Yes.
Okay. This student goes to a university that there's a Confucius Institute where they fly the Chinese flag. If you are a Catholic priest, you will not be invited to a Confucius Institute. If you are a Protestant pastor, you will not be allowed to go to a Confucius Institute. If you're a Buddhist monk, I mean, look what they've done to Tibet. There are 160 Tibetan monks and nuns that have poured kerosene on their bodies, set themselves aflame. You will not be allowed to come to a Confucius Institute. If you're a Falun Gong, you cannot come to a Confucius Institute. So I talked to this young student who was circulating a letter asking the university to remove, and if you remember, how many of you saw Director Wray of the FBI, his comments 2 months ago, where he said they are basically a spying operation. They are also putting pressure on good Chinese students who were glad to hear because they're afraid, because the Confucius Institute will send words back to intimidate their families back. This student contacted every Christian group on the campus. This student sent all the passages in the Bible about what Jesus said, why they ought to be involved. And not one Christian group, not one Christian group on that campus was willing to sign the letter.
Wow.
The church is fundamentally failing. And I think we all, if we really care, this is just kind of, well, we want to talk about it. If we really care, we ought to be prepared to do what Dr. Martin Luther King did, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and William Wilberforce. We ought to be prepared to go to jail. And if we're not prepared to go to jail, frankly, our faith has not penetrated us.
That's right.
That's true.
That's right.
Did you feel the passion?
Yes.
This is the spirit. Congressman Wolf, I think just a point of clarification. My guess is that in most of those cases where the Confucius Institutes are operating on these campuses, and there are over 100 of them still, a number of them have been rolled up, but you're not welcome on the campus if you're a Falun Gong, if you're a Tibetan, if you're in any way at odds with the Confucius Institute. It's not just you're not going to visit the institute itself. That's wrong, clearly. We're going to hear more about that, I think, in a moment from our friend Bob Fu. But before we do, I wanted to ask Dr. Shayo Abijoye of the Mission Africa International to speak about what is happening in one of the first of the countries that you mentioned, Congressman, Nigeria, and the surrounding area, the Lake Chad region. You'll hear some more passion, I think, from Dr. Shayo. Thank you very much for being with us, sir.
Thank you. I come to this from a very, very personal angle. For me, it is not theoretical. For me, these are children that I have held. These are women that I have worked with. These are young people that I have hung out with. This January, Pastor Andimi was beheaded by Boko Haram, actually by his wife, beheaded on video. This January, in December, for 12 days, I was with 20 young people, among 50 from Pastor Andimi's church. How do I respond to that? And now I'm watching the pastor of my friends with his next big cut on video. A few days ago, I was in Jos City. The house in which I stayed, there's a young man who frequents that house. It is not his house, but it's the house of one of the places of his mentor. And I stayed in that house. And Boko Haram captured that boy. And on video, a 10-year-old boy that comes to the house that I also come to, on video, they shot him. They shot him at the back of his head. A Part 1 student in the university going back to college to resume. They stopped the car and they made them come out. If you're a Christian, they separate you. If you're a Muslim, you're free to go. And they shot him. And I can keep giving you examples. In camp in Abuja, as I speak to you now, I have about 50 young people from the Northeast. In another camp, in a school, in the Middle Belt, we have about 250 young people children. One of them, when you get into his house, he would ask you, "Are you my father?" Every male person that enters his house, his mother's house, he would ask them, "Are you my father?" Because his father was beheaded. So I had to tell his mother to tell him that Dr. Shayo is his father.
Amen.
This is the reality in our world. I'm sorry.
No, we understand.
And as all of this is happening, the government of my nation has not been able to prosecute even one person. And this has been going on for how many years?
10 years.
For 10 years. Not one person has been prosecuted. The Nigerian army has been infiltrated and compromised. they cannot do the job again. I stand in this place and just this last week, the government said we have rehabilitated 963 Boko Haram members, and we are releasing them into the Nigerian army. So the Nigerian army cannot be depended on again. The Nigerian army was a professional army. The Nigerian army that I grew up with can be depended on. But times have changed. And the situation now is that the army cannot be depended on to do this job. The question is, how does this affect you? How does this affect all of us? The people that are doing this work, the jihadists, I know that governments of the world like to create moral equivalence. Oh, this is farmer-other conflict. The people that are doing the work have never called themselves others. They are very clear. We are jihadists. We are Islamists. Now, we don't like to say that, but permit me to tell you that these are hardened Islamists. And you know, I stay in the United States of America and I eat my burger, and Trump woke up one morning and blew Kwazan out of it, you know, blew him up. And some people are barely acting.
That's right.
And I'm saying, do you even have an idea what Kwazan will do to you if he has the chance? You don't even have. In the back of my house, I heard with my ears an Islamist preaching, saying, if my daughter, he was talking about his own daughter, said, if my daughter ever dares become a Christian, I will behead her. So if you can do that to your own daughter, what can you do to another man's child?
Right. Exactly.
They believe that this is their call, that this is what they are being commanded to do by the Quran. And you know, we can whitewash it from here to kingdom come, and it's not going to go away. The reality is that the Quran said they should behead you. That if they can capture you, they should behead you. That's the reality. What are you going to do with that? So the question is, so the jihadists said, we want to create a caliphate. We want that caliphate to be a base from which we can attack the West. They have never made a secret of it.
Yes.
So Trump went to Syria, dislodged them. Guess what they did? They crossed the Mediterranean and came to the Sahel. So all the weapons, and you know, I don't like to talk about, you know, politicizing some of these issues, but they are political.
They are. Exactly.
What happened in Libya just released a floodgate of weapons into the Sahel of Africa. And all those weapons, you see all this ragtag army carrying sophisticated equipment. And you're asking yourself, where do they get it? And they're ready to use it. And they will use it against the United States one day if we don't stop them now.
Amen.
So I am come to this place just following the elder statesman and saying, we have to do something. These people, they are not nice. You cannot reason with them.
That's it.
We have to stop them. You know, the only way that we had 50 to 100 years of peace in Nigeria that allowed us to become a modern nation is because the British destroyed the caliphate. Now we need another generation have to stop this.
Yes.
And I am challenging us to take this message out. this lily-livered Western proposition that everything is, just hunky-dory, it's not true.
That's right.
Out there, people are dying in their thousands. The month of January alone, 635 people were verified executed. In Nigeria, we are not talking about Burkina Faso. We are not talking about Mali. We are not talking about Niger. We are not talking about Cameroon. All the countries that surround Nigeria. In my country alone, 635 people in 1 month. In 1 month. So I've come to challenge you and to say, let's do something together. One thing we can do is let there be an understanding that these nations are at war, and it is not a farmer-herder conflict. It's a jihad.
Yes.
It's a jihad to create a caliphate. Number two, I plead with the United States government. I plead with the United States people. This is the only hope of the universe right now. It's the United States of America, not Europe. Europe has been compromised.
Yes.
Please send us a special envoy. A special envoy for the Sahelian region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, this is a passionate appeal from hard experience. This experience needs to be shared so that more of us understand what is in fact underway. This is true as well in China. I'm very pleased to have a member of the board of directors of Save the Persecuted Christians with us. He is also the founder and president of a terrific organization, China Aid. His name is Dr. Bob Fu, and he has come to us from China. And he has spent the years since he got out there tirelessly championing the cause of Christians and other people of faith who are suffering at the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. If you can, quickly, tell us a bit about it, Dr. Fu, and what needs to be done.
Thank you, Frank. I can't thank enough for the hero, First Congressman Frank Wolf, for your years of leadership. Without any exaggeration, you are the rallying cry for us to be encouraged and move on. Despite of the setbacks and discouragement by the evil regimes, by the persecutors. In China, of course, the Chinese communist regime may not have beheaded the individual Christians or members of the independent faith, but I could call it, since this Chinese new president Xi Jinping, the brutal dictator, took power, there is a massive movement. I think it's a beheading of the church movement.
Wow.
Beheading the church movement. You're talking about hundreds of thousands. This is just a small samples. Hundreds of thousands of the crosses were being forcefully demolished, destroyed, burned. What's it, a wooden cross have to do with the Chinese Communist Party? We know from the scripture that's a symbol of who is the head of the church,
Amen.
right? Beheading of the church. And if you don't, from last year, if you don't put the portrait of Chairman Xi Jinping and Chairman Mao on the pulpit before you sing the national anthem, the Communist Party's national anthem, as the first item of worship on Sunday. The pastor would be sent to re-education camps. Brothers and sisters, we knew the persecution had been happening since the Communist Party took power 70 years ago. But never really since the end of the Cultural Revolution 40 years ago, we have seen this kind of most systematic, comprehensive, and the Communist Party nationwide engineered campaign to eradicate, behead the church. Some, by the way, said, some Christians find, well, you have both Chairman Mao and the Chairman Xi on both sides, a little red cross on both sides. Some church leaders said, amusingly, when was the last time there are two guys were hanged on both sides of the cross? They may not understand that spiritually, so except we know one guy is already somewhere, definitely, and the other guy is still alive. We still have a chance. We can pray for his salvation.
Exactly.
But this is deadly serious. The Chinese Communist Party literally forbidden anyone under 18 years old, enshrined by the law. It took effect on February the 1st, 2018. That nobody under 18 years old, nobody as a student, nobody as even nurse and medical doctors is even allowed to enter into the church building. Millions of Chinese children, Christian children, were forced to sign a Communist Party prepared form to renounce their faith after on and on consistent threat to their parents, their teachers, in order to sign that form to renounce their faith. This has not happened since the end of Cultural Revolution. We have seen, of course, hundreds of thousands of Christians, the pastors, including the government-sanctioned church pastors, just simply when they refuse to volunteer, knock down, use the bulldozer to tear down the cross from the rooftop of the church building, some were sentenced to 8 years, 10 years imprisonment. If we don't believe that, we have their number, have their name, sentence, the prison on our website. And thank God, for raising up the Save the Persecuted Church. And thank you, Frank, for your leadership to raise the awareness and take action. Last week, Secretary Pompeo, I think, made a very astonishing statement that was not really picked up by many. He said the Chinese Communist Party posed the most serious and the biggest threat to today's United States America. I think it's not only United States America, it's to the whole civilization. So the Communist Party is not only persecuting one religion, as Congressman Wolf just mentioned. It's any faith. You talk about Catholicism, Catholics, you talk about Falun Gong, you talk about Tibetan Buddhists, you talk about this 1 to 3 million Uyghurs, predominantly Muslims, in the concentration camp. And they are exporting this persecution outside China. Their long arm had already extended to the United States. Look at what the NBA manager, the Houston Rockets, who censored themselves just because one tweet from Houston. Chinese Communist Party would make everybody kind of humble themselves. But here are, quick a few things we can do. I think, first of all, I really like the specific initiatives Congressman Wolf has been really urging us to do. When can we all unite together to tell each one of these American universities, including George Washington, Georgetown, all these universities who are hosting 100 Confucius Institute, the open spying institution, and threatening our the American students. When can we kick them out one by one? They're not welcomed, right? And when I think that's a specific action, and we should also, I think, take those Chinese pop-up companies here in the United States who are really helping China to do surveillance. Every church, if you now allow to exist, is mandated to install a face recognition camera on the pulpit in order to monitor everyone, especially those who are under 18 years old or Communist Party member. So that kind of technology is aided, transferred directly from the United States. So we need to take action to tell them, stop, enough. Thank you.
I hate to be trying to shorten these, but we do have several other speakers that I want to make sure we have time to hear from, because each of them has a story to tell about another part of the world, another country in which Christians are being horribly persecuted. And we want all of these insights to inform the calls to action here. I'm going to ask Christina Arriaga, who formerly, until very recently, served as a member of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, which, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, was the direct result of the statute, which is now known as the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, first installed 20-some years ago, and Christina has recently left and is now free to speak, among other things, about what is going on in Cuba, from which she has, to Christians and others. Thank you so much for joining us, Christina. Welcome to.
My pleasure. Well, thank you very much. As a Cuban American, I have a very strong commitment to freedom of speech. So being silenced at the commission was something that I could not stand. So I resigned in protest. In Washington, being a friend of mine calls it Hollywood for the ugly, the news of my resignation reached further out, and actually Mr. Wolf wrote me the same day, urging me to take on more action and raise more awareness about what is going on. So I will speak very, very briefly about what's going on in Cuba. Every time anyone asks me where I'm from, because they hear my accent, say I'm Cuban American, they'll say, oh, it's a beautiful country. I went there to visit 2 years ago. Oh, isn't it great that we have opened the doors? My husband calls it a conversation killer when I tell them that anyone who travels to Cuba as a tourist is complicit in the repression of Christians in the island. So I'm going to speak about two cases in Cuba that you should know about. One is Abiud. He's 8 years old. And his crime is that his father is a pastor in a church that has been approved by the Cuban government. But when the pastor complained that the government was meddling with his homilies, instead of going after the adult pastor, the Cuban government went after this 8-year-old child, repressing this child through his own teachers at the school system. Wow. Can you imagine your kid goes to school and the teachers at the school are bullying him because of what you said or did? The other case is of two pastors, Pastor Regal and his wife, saw their children also being harassed at the schools, so they contacted a Christian school in Guatemala and asked for them to send the homeschooling materials. For that, they were imprisoned, where they still are. Custody of their children was removed by the Cuban government. And in addition, this poor Roman Catholic lawyer who simply went to the court that day to volunteer and give moral support was also imprisoned. There was an arbitrary detention. None of the systems that had to be followed were followed. But here's the kicker. The head of the agency in charge of repression of all religions in Cuba is a woman who's named Caridad Diego. Caridad Diego has an open visa to travel to the United States, where she comes to go shopping. And she comes to visit her family. So there are three things you can do. Congress has given us very powerful tools in the form of the Magnitsky Act, for instance, in order to ensure that individuals who are repressing others, violating the human rights of others, are unable to send their family to come here and shop for Christmas.
Praise the Lord.
Okay? Department of Treasury and Department of Commerce, Department of State are all involved in this decision. Something else we can do. Our people in Havana should not be giving visas to any of the people that repress others. Not only that, but they should be publicizing them. I've gotten calls from not thousands, but for many pastors in Cuba who have told me that even the threat of having the visa revoked is effective. Third thing, the Cuban government has a list of pastors that are unable to leave the island anymore. So they are consistently detained at the airport and forbidden to go to religious conferences. Those pastors need our help. So while pastors cannot leave Cuba, no tourist should be able to go into Cuba and enjoy the rights of freedom and of flying out of the beach and of eating 3 square meals a day. And these are rights that none of the repressed pastors have in Cuba. Thank you very much.
We had hoped to have a very highly regarded and acclaimed bishop from Sudan with us today. Unfortunately, he is somewhere, I think, in the city, but he's not feeling well. So we have deputized one of our most important allies in the fight for international religious freedom, a founding member of our Save the Persecuted Christians coalition, and really a leader in this movement for decades. Her name is Faith McDonald. She heads up the Religious Freedom Program at the Institute on Religion and Democracy, and has, I think it's fair to say, done more for the people who suffer at the hands of the Sudanese government in particular than just about anybody. And so it's an honor to give her a chance to talk a little bit about the need for a new Sudan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thank you all for being here. Thank you especially to the Hungarian government who continue to bless me by what you're doing and by speaking out and helping. I'm going to be talking about 2 countries because when I started working on Sudan back in 1993, there was only one country, the country of Sudan, that was the Islamic Republic of Sudan. We had a speaker come to IRD, the journalist David Aikman, and he said in his speech that the worst persecution of Christians going on at that time, in the 90s this was Sudan. And my then boss, the late Diane Nipper, said, Faith, we've got to concentrate on Sudan. So I've been doing it ever since, never given up on that. You can see this poster of Sudan, the Nuba Mountains, where Bishop Ndudu, who is a dear friend of mine, comes from, where he is the bishop. That's still going on. You know, we hear good things now about Sudan. Things are changing, and they are. But there are people who don't want it to change. There are people who have an agenda that has not changed for Sudan. In fact, in 2017, those people who were meeting with President Bashir at the time, in their meeting in the parliament, we got a leaked copy of the documents, said, oh, our friends in Nigeria, Boko Haram, we need to help them spread. And our friends in ISIS, we need to give them safe passage through Africa. That's what the Khartoum regime was doing. And of course, if you look back at the years since the time when Bashir had been made president, there was genocide, there was slavery of black African Christians and Muslims by the people in the north who considered themselves superior to the black African Christians and Muslims in the south. There was aerial bombardment, and that is why these children are in the rocks, in the caves, in the Nuba Mountains, because they're trying to escape from the bombs falling from the plains, from the Antonov plains. There was scorched earth, there was starvation, and I rejoice that there have been changes in Sudan, but much more needs to happen. If Bishop Ndudu were here, he would tell you that right now the leadership of Sudan is kind of playing a game. Some of them are honest, but others are playing a shell game. They have a game that they've used for years that they call change the face. So you put a new person in and, oh, this person's much better. You know, at the State Department, they'll tell us, he's not a hardliner. Sure. Well, we find out the truth when it's too late. And we have given too many, what do you call it? Not sticks, but cookies, really, to Khartoum before they have done anything to deserve them. So our government needs to be stronger. We need to hold their feet to the fire. And what Bishop Ndudu would say is, we need to tell them no to Sharia in their constitution, their new constitution, because there are those who are trying to put it in. And, you know, we saw that the demonstrations in Khartoum, the students, things like that. But remember that decades before that, there were people dying for their faith to stand against that. They didn't just demonstrate in the streets because they didn't have petrol or they didn't have bread. They were being slaughtered for their faith and standing against it. So the people of Nuba Mountains, within Sudan, of course, and in South Sudan, and I'm going to pivot too and talk about South Sudan. My dear friend and sister in Christ, the former Minister for Health in Jonglei State in South Sudan is here. Jahan, stand up. Jahan Dang. And you know, you've heard things about South Sudan. It's a nation. It's a sovereign nation with a sovereign, freely, fairly elected president. But there are those who want to destroy South Sudan and have made things more and more difficult, made things more and more deceptive. If you could hear from this lady how when the former vice president of South Sudan attempted the coup in 2013 and she was in Jonglei where his troops moved to and had to flee to a refugee camp in Jonglei in Bor to escape from them and found that the camp was already full of the families of the terrorists. So we need to speak the truth about South Sudan. They're right now at the point where they could have peace. They have a peace agreement, and there's a new government being formed. We need to support that effort. The whole world needs to support that effort because South Sudan was supposed to be a shining light of freedom and democracy, and there are forces that have tried to stop it. So for both Sudan and South Sudan, no caliphate, no Sharia, none of this mess. Let it be what God intended it to be. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mention has been made by several of us already, but I want to take a moment just to say a special word of thanks to the government of Hungary, which is represented here. It is represented here both by our friend State Secretary Tristan Azbej and by the ambassador of Hungary to the United States, who have both been extraordinarily effective in their advocacy, as is their government, for Christians who are being persecuted around the world. I have the privilege of being among those. My colleague, wonderful Didi Laugesen, Executive Director of Save the Persecuted Christians, Faith, and others of us who were in Hungary, in Budapest, in November for the second annual International Conference on Christian Persecution. It was an extraordinary gathering of people who share our concern and who are, I think, anxious to work with the government of Hungary, which is really playing an exemplary role as a government to ensure that this issue, this catastrophe, is not only getting attention, but is getting addressed by the government of Hungary and its counterparts. And I think it's fair to say you've had a very words about it, if you would, please.
Dear brothers and sisters, I'm truly humbled to speak after such recognition, and most of all to speak after such strong testimonies coming from Africa and then Asia. And let me start with what our Nigerian brother said. Last month, only 630 Nigerian Christians were murdered by jihadis. One of them, we just received the tragic news at the end of last week, was an 18-year-old Catholic seminary, a young boy who wanted to be a man of God, but he was executed. And I don't know if you heard about this news, but in the Democratic Republic of Congo, about 12 Christians were beheaded by the local affiliate of ISIS or Daesh. In Bangladesh, Christian Rohingya refugees were murdered by Islamists. In Burkina Faso, where we had just been on a fact-finding mission a few weeks ago, at the same place where we were, more than 35 Christians were murdered at the marketplace by jihadi bombings. And I could go on. I haven't even heard about the cases in China and India. I would like to ask you, how many of you have heard about these cases on the news cycle of CNN? None. About a European guest, how many of you have heard about any of these atrocities on BBC? Only of these happened in January. Have you heard about it on any major media outlet? Okay. As a reference point, how many of you heard about reporting on the terrible atrocities committed against innocent Muslim believers in Christchurch on CNN or BBC? You have heard about that, and that's right, because they deserve all the grief and all the commemoration and all the outrage against the terrorists who committed. But wouldn't the Christians deserve the same?
Yes.
Wouldn't they? Wouldn't they? Only those martyrs who had been martyred this January. Wouldn't they? And I'm asking a very painful question. Doesn't the lives and the dignity of Christian people worth the same than anyone else?
Yes.
So why don't we talk about it? Why is it not on the agenda of the United Nations, of the European Union, and so on? Why doesn't Christian lives matter? And I know that there is no such a thing as competition of martyrdom, but we have to talk about the proportions. We have heard about the statistics and facts that more than 250, even perhaps more than 3 million Christians are persecuted or discriminated in the world. And we also know that from several independent reports that that's about 80% of all of the people who are persecuted for their faith and belief. So we can say that Christianity is the most persecuted religious group in the world. Yet it doesn't get even a passing mention at the major human rights forum. And I'm standing in front of you not as a human rights activist. I'm leading a government program that is a humanitarian aid program to help and aid the persecuted Christians. But as I was listening to these testimonies, I understood that our mission is twofold. The most important thing is saving lives. Amen. So this is what we do through the Hungry Health Program, and this is what we do with you. We are trying to save lives, we are trying to save communities, but we have another very important mission, and that is to be the voice of those that are not heard. Yes. To be the voice of those who are suffering in the sanctuary. It shouldn't be a Christian problem. All of humanity should stand up and come to the aid of persecuted Christians, but not even the Christian countries as a study to work. And I can say that we have received much recognition that Hungary was the first government to start a government-organized and state-funded dedicated program for persecuted Christians. I think in the whole of the world, I'm the only one with a government title that has the term persecuted Christians in its title. But I don't want to be that. I don't want to be lonely. And, it would be good PR to pose as the lonely champions and protectors of Christendom among the government, but this is not right. We want competition.
That's right.
That. And then what the Trump administration is doing here is promising, but where are all the other Christian countries, the cultural Christian countries? They are busy trying to deny that they are Christian,
That's
and
right.
they're objecting the fact. So what we are fighting here in the south and in the east is a humanitarian crisis, but also at the same time, what we are fighting in the west is an identity crisis.
That's right.
And
Yes.
both of these are leading to the collapse of basically the civilization, the Western civilization, and those who belong as a minority in the west and the east. So I should be talking about our program too. It started 2.5 years ago, and it's nice to say that we were the first, but it started at the end of 2016. First, we focused on the Middle East, and I must say that even we're proud to be doing this, but what happened in Iraq and Syria, I mean, Daesh has occupied the Nineveh Plains in 2014. So even as first responders, we were shamefully and terribly late with that. But over the course of 2.5 years, we have worked, distributed humanitarian aid with churches and to persecuted religious communities among other communities, together with the Christians in Iraq, Syria, to the refugee and IDP communities in Lebanon, in Jordan. And as we have learned more about the nature and extent of Christian persecution, now we are turning more and more focus on Africa. The situation in the Middle East is somewhat consolidated. Of course, there is terrible bloodshed, but we hear less and less fatalities and martyred victims of Christians in the Middle East. There are still terribly many of them, but if we compare it to what's happening in West Africa, there is a genocide going on, and then the whole world is turning a blind eye. So we are keeping our focus also on the Middle East. We are reconstructing churches too, but we are reconstructing hospitals, Christian hospitals, and Christian schools for the returning refugees and migrants and for the IDPs. And of course we are criticized because it's a sin to be Christian and it's a sin to support the persecuted Christians. One of the criticism is that we get that it is immoral to only support Christians. But this is, of course, a misunderstanding. I'm naive, so I'm saying that it's a misunderstanding. I'm just giving you one example. We are supporting the operation of 3 Catholic hospitals overall in the Middle East. And 80% of the patients in these Catholic hospitals are Muslim. Because that is the Christian solidarity. So through our program, we are not only helping the Christians, but we are promoting religious coexistence. If we talk about the Middle East, probably the most important project of ours is supporting the Chaldean Christian community of Tel Askuf. It's on the Nineveh Plains, so biblical grounds. It was occupied by Daesh in 2014. Everyone had to flee who couldn't have fled was murdered on the site. And by the time it was freed in 2016, of course it was completely deserted, and then also 900 buildings were damaged. And it only took less than $2 million donation. When it comes to reconstruction and humanitarian aid, it is nothing. And that we provided directly to the Chaldean Christians to reconstruct Tel Askuf, and 3/4 of the families who had fled from there returned. So basically, a community was saved with a direct action in a country where over the course of 15 years, the number of Christians has went from 1.5 million to 250,000. So it is possible to save these vulnerable communities if we turn towards them, we start to care, and we provide direct donation to them. And the locals have renamed their town from Tel Askuf to Tel Askuf Bint al-Majar. My pronunciation probably is terrible, but it means Tel Askuf, daughter of Hungary. And then this is an important thing. This is something we want to replicate, but we wouldn't only want to see daughters and sons of Hungary. We would like to see daughters and sons of the United Nations, of the United States, of Germany, of the European Union. We are going well with the United States. In October, we have announced that Hungary and the US, namely USAID, we will, in a cooperation, reconstruct the largest Christian majority town in Iraq, that is Karakosh. Now, turning on to Africa, we hear that most of those who are murdered because of their faith in Christ are in Nigeria. So we have started there with the Catholic and evangelical church called Church of Christ projects worth of $5 million, and that's enough to reconstruct several schools, several clinics in an area that is still devastated by Boko Haram and by the Fulani. And here is something about the hypocrisy of the Western governments. I raised the issue of Nigeria and the anti-Christian and the anti-moderate Muslim persecution in Nigeria to, I'm not going to say the country because it is aired on Facebook, and I don't want to start a diplomatic scandal, to one of the major Western, one of the senior diplomats of one of the major Western countries. And I was telling about, I think 4,000 of Christians being murdered because of religious persecution, and then the answer was that it has nothing to do with religious persecution. And I asked that, what does jihadi herdsmen attacking Christian villages, burning people alive in churches, tearing down the churches and then being mosques, how is that not religious persecution? Then what it is? And the answer was, it is because of climate change. So this is something that I have, in some sense, this is funny, but in other sense, this is tragic. Another Western diplomat of a formerly a culturally Christian country, when I talked about persecution of Christians in the Middle East, they asked me the most ignorant question, that why did they go there? It's a kind of Christianity. So talking about our humanitarian program, throughout 2 years, the number of beneficiaries of our humanitarian aid is 70,000. That's a good effort, but if we say that there are 250 million persecuted Christians, then that means that we have about 249 million 300,000 more. And no one can expect, of course, the government of Hungary and a country that is only 10 million people to address this whole crisis of a global scale. So what we are doing is we are seeking government partners. We want to build an alliance for persecuted Christians. That's why we are very enthusiastic, and we welcome the US initiative for the International Alliance for Religious Freedom. One thing that we have to watch is that persecuted Christians are not left out. We had heard a wonderful speech by President Trump today mentioning the cause of persecuted Christians, but we have also heard, it was actually a prayer, and it is terrible to criticize a prayer by a very high-level American dignitary from the Democratic Party, and I have heard all the different persecuted religious minorities mentioned and paid for. Only that one that is persecuted in the highest number, that was left out. This is something we have to fight. If this is ignorance, then we have to educate. If this is denial, then we have to break the wall of silence here around the biggest human rights crisis of our time, and also the most concealed human rights crisis of our time. And I very much appreciate and I'm grateful to God for all your alliance in that. And finally, if I can abuse my time for a little bit more, I think I'm coming from probably the only country, at least in the European Union, where a government politician can talk about his faith without being publicly ashamed or stoned to death. Actually, the liberals are trying, but who cares? They can't hurt us, so I want to share, this is a prayer breakfast, that we can do all the work that is needed to be done, but prayer is the most important.
Yeah.
I believe in the power of prayer,
Yes.
and I want to
Awesome.
tell our brothers and sisters who are representing persecuted communities here that please take back the message. We are faithful to our brothers and sisters that you are not abandoned. You are not alone. We hear your suffering in countries like the United States, but also in countries probably your people never heard of, like Hungary. There are all around the people who don't even know you personally but care about you, and we are not going to abandon you. So thank you for
I'm hoping we can reserve a few minutes for questions and answers, and I appreciate everybody's patience in hearing these important testimonies. I did just want to make a quick couple of points about what we're trying to do as an organization, as a new coalition-based entity, about these various problems that we've identified, and of course there are many more that aren't here. But these are illustrative of the challenges that we're facing. As a civilization, I think this is really the point. This is Western civilization. This is Christendom that's on the line. As I mentioned earlier, we believe there's a special urgency associated with holding those who are persecuting Christians accountable for what they're doing. In any one of these countries, it starts with those who are either in power, who are directly responsible, or turning a blind eye to what is being done in their countries. And I wanted to say, Dr. Sayo deserves also recognition for his courage as a man who is going back into Nigeria frequently and bearing witness to this problem. Secondly, we need, as a country, and as a coalition of countries, to hold those who are responsible for this kind of outrage accountable for what they're doing and creating costs to them for doing it. I mentioned earlier the role that the President of the United States played with respect to Turkey. I think that was illustrative of the cause, but there's so much more that can be done. Whether there's sanctions, the Magnitsky Act was mentioned, whether it's the opportunity to withhold foreign aid. It's been a little controversial of late, but it can be done, and in this case certainly should. Military sales, political legitimacy and recognition as examples. Now all of that takes some help from the government. And in order for the government to be helpful, even when the leadership of the government is basically on board, it needs to know this matters to the people. So one of the things that we're doing, and it goes back to what Congressman Frank Wolf was saying earlier, yes, it falls to pastors to be preaching about this, but it also falls to their congregants and others to come together to demand, whether it's of their faith leaders or whether it's of their elected representatives, to demand that this sort of egregious harm is called out as such and is punished. So we are in the business as an organization of trying to create a grassroots movement for that purpose. If you'd like to learn more about what we're doing and how we're doing it, please check with Dee Dee or me after this program, or simply go to saveUsChristians.org. SaveUsChristians.org. And finally, I just want to make one other point. Thank you, Bob. Sorry, Tristan, you have to go too shortly. One of the things that we recognize is that even with good leadership, even with grassroots demands for action, to the extent that you are still dependent upon the government to do things, it's challenging. And one of the things that with Congressman Frank Wolf's strong encouragement, inspiration as well as encouragement, Save the Persecuted Christians undertook to do last year, and we will be redoubling our efforts this year, is to hold accountable not just the persecutors, but also the enablers of the persecutors. And I want to give you just one example. It's hardly the only one. But in this city, across this country, and around the world, persecutors of Christians are being very powerfully represented by a law firm called Squire Patton Boggs. If you have trouble remembering that name, the acronym is illustrative. SPB could stand for Stop Persecuting Believers, which by virtue of representing the government of Communist China, the government of the Palestinian Authority, the government of Cameroon, government, I'm losing some, it's been a while since I mentioned this, Qatar and
It used to be Sudan.
Sudan was pushed out. Anyway, the point is, that law firm and others should not be given access to the offices of people they are lobbying without being held accountable themselves for what they're doing to enable this kind of behavior. So I leave that with you as another thought. And finally, on your seats, thanks to my colleague Dee, you should have a copy of this letter, which was just sent yesterday to President Trump. I'd like to think he read it and responded to it a little bit today, but maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But he should, and he hopefully will in the future. Speak boldly about what is being done here. This nightmare in our time needs the vocal calling out, the vocal challenge. Everything else will flow from that. Again, I want to thank Tristan, Ambassador, others of you from Hungary, for your exemplary leadership in doing just that, and our call to our countrymen and women, and those of the rest of the civilized world, to join you in this effort. With that, we'll take a couple of questions. Stephen Anada, one of our great friends and allies from Nigeria as well.
Yeah, my name is Stephen Anada. I represent the International Committee on Nigeria. What I would like to bring to the fore is just very simple. When the United States imposed a visa ban on Nigeria, Nigeria sent an envoy immediately to the United States. So for me, it's been in the last how many years we've been talking roundtable, everything, but what will work and that will compel Nigeria government to stop persecuting Christians is by imposing more sanctions. And that is what I think will give us a kind of leverage points over Nigeria government. Sanction and sanction and sanction. That is the language you get.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, let me just say, just this week, there was a binational sort of conversation taking place between the United States government and that of Nigeria. I hope those sorts of leverage were expressly conveyed. Stephen, I don't know. There continues to be, and this is one of the reasons why speaking boldly is so important, there continues to be this, well, false narrative that the problem has nothing to do with faith. The problem has nothing to do with intolerance of Christians specifically. It does, and it needs to be properly responded to. Thank you. I'm so grateful for your participation. God bless you.
Before they go,
Thank you.
may I just address you before you go?
I'm not going, but
I'm a
these folks are
chaplain,
in
no, before they need to go.
Could we
You have a
pray?
lot of chaplains,
Yeah,
you have
could
a
we
lot
pray
of
over them?
pastors here.
Yes, could we pray over them?
over you?
Yes,
Please.
and
Can we do
you,
that
yeah.
before
That
you
would be
leave?
wonderful.
Yes, and you
Especially
too.
because you're going back
Yes,
and
we're gonna pray
going
over
back into harm's way.
Quickly, please.
Father, yes. Extend your hands to them.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you. Yes, Heavenly Father, these are men and women that have stood and will stand for humanity and for justice, Lord God. We pray, Lord God, that you would put the iron dome of Psalm 91 around and about them, Lord God. We pray that no weapon formed against them will prosper, and that you would help them escape any danger that comes near their door. Father, amplify their voices. And as our senator said, or congressman said, that we as pastors, we as leaders, we as people will be willing to lay down our lives as well to make sure that this issue is brought to the forefront and finished in Jesus' name. Father, we thank you for all of their efforts.
Yes.
Help us to continue to open up their doors, that you would give them greater audience, especially with President Trump, that he will follow through in a marvelous and miraculous way. In Jesus' name.
Amen. In Jesus' name, yes.